Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders, and welcome to this re-release of my Lancaster series. This episode started off as just an introduction to the actual Lancaster episode, but then grew and grew until I decided to split it off onto its own. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank Howard April for sending us the book on modern aircraft. Initially, I thought it would be more of a book for Tanner, being that it's about modern aircraft, but as it was published in 1942, we are both fans of these modern aircraft. Okay, so let's dive into this one. The Avro Lancaster is the warbird with which I have had the most personal connections with over the years, and is the primary reason for my obsession with warbirds in the first place, and thus is why I am engaged in making this podcast that you are listening to right now. As a kid growing up in the 70s, I had found a souvenir aircraft recognition pamphlet that my parents had brought back from the National Aviation Museum in Ottawa. Two airplanes in that booklet really got my attention. The first was the Henkel HE-162 Volksjager, partly because it looked so weird with the jet engine on its back, and also because it had a swastika painted on it, which as a kid I knew was taboo. But the other one was the Avro Lancaster. Although the details on engines, range, weaponry didn't make any sense to me at the time, the picture itself was so impressive. The thing just seemed to exude power. It didn't hurt that it was painted black, and in my child's mind, the idea that this machine went out at night to punish the bad Nazis made it a superhero in my mind. The icing on the cake was that on the Lancaster's page in the booklet, the last section was a general impression, where only two words were written: simply massive. It was as if the serious writers of this serious booklet had also been overwhelmed. Wow, what an airplane. I was hooked. I made my fair share of Lancs out of Lego, which flew many missions over the enemy territory of my younger brother's room. Some of these, like the real thing, failed to return to base. Then I discovered the Dam Busters movie, Wow Again. They were using my favorite airplane to fly low and knock out Nazi dams. Just like the climactic scene in Star Wars, except exchanging Lancs for X-Wings and the Wallace bouncing bombs for proton torpedoes. Wait a minute, was it possible that Star Wars had copied the Dam Busters? My mind was blown before I even knew the expression. Then one day, my dad revealed that his boss had flown as a navigator in Lancs. Well, I pushed for details and stories, but was disappointed when Dad wasn't able to provide any juicy combat tales. Dad told me that his boss had considered it, open quotes, the most boring job he had ever done, close quotes. Sitting in the dark, having to calculate their position every 15 minutes over and over and over again. He said that they had never seen a night fighter and were only mildly worried about the flak. He said it was because he had entered the service late and that the war was basically over. Was it just modesty, or a strategy to avoid talking about the war? I have no way of knowing. Most of his stories told to my dad were about wartime Air Force life on the base. Stealing coal to keep their hut warm. Supposedly, visiting Brits would ask why this hut was so much warmer than the others, and the Canucks would answer that because they came from Canada, they knew how to make a fire better. He also had a tip to avoid being tapped for extra duties at the air station. which I remembered during my own military service and even into the working world. Walk fast and carry a handful of papers or blueprints. The superiors will figure you've already got something more important to do. One ominous airborne story that did give me the shivers was that he said if they were ever lost and tried to use the radio to ask for help, they would quickly be given directions by a sweet-sounding lady who spoke perfect English. The lady was a member of the Luftwaffe, and she would direct them to their doom in the sights of a German night fighter. During late elementary school, I entered a mail-in contest where I had to write a short essay about my dream of a lifetime. And I wrote that I wanted to parachute out of a Lancaster bomber. Yes, I guess I was a weird kid. Anyway, I didn't win the contest. Then one summer, during early high school, while staying at a friend's cottage, I discovered his dad's bookshelf. If you're about my age and you're listening to a Warbirds podcast, then you probably remember discovering a bookshelf like this. No, not that type of bookshelf. This one was stuffed with books about the war, about the SS, about tanks, and the long row of the Time Life encyclopedia about the Second World War. Again, if you're about my age, you've seen it. Hardcover with black and white pictures and red foil titles on the covers. Pre-internet, this was pure treasure on the subject. But the book that really got me was Len Deighton's novel that's just called Bomber. After a day of cottage fun, water skiing, playing in the lake, and eating hot dogs and marshmallows, I curled up and started reading this amazing book that covers the story of one RAF bombing raid. The book is a couple of paperback inches thick and only covers the time period of only one night, but it includes everyone involved in the raid. From the civilians living near the RAF aerodrome, to the RAF leadership planning the raid, to the armorers and mechanics prepping the plane, to the Lancaster crews getting ready, to the night fighter and flak crews trying to hunt them down, to the regular German citizens on the ground at the receiving end of the raid. It is unflinchingly honest and neutral, and although fiction, brutally truthful. No one is good or bad. They have all just been funneled by fate and history into this meat grinder of battle. The flight crews on both sides are astonishingly real, and the characters are well-rounded. There's the tired, almost washed-up Lancaster pilot who doesn't even really need to take notes during the briefing anymore, to the brand new guys on their first mission who are more worried about making mistakes in their logbooks than they are of flak. Even the Luftwaffe night fighter guys weren't monolithic. Yes, there was the hardcore perfectionist, and the sloppy pilot who didn't follow procedures, and all the others in between. In print, this book so vividly brought us along on the raid that after reading it, you feel like you've been there. You feel like you know enough to just hop in, grab a checklist, start up, and take off. Here's a confession. I didn't finish the book that night, and so took it home from the cottage, intending to return it after. I never did return it. I've still got it. That was about 35 years ago. Shh, don't tell. So, fast forward to when I was doing my own flight training in my late 20s. When I was doing night flying training, it brought me back to that book and struck me one day at the tremendous difficulty of what the real Lancaster crews did. I like flying at night. Even aside from all the technological aids such as ForeFlight, which is an app on my iPad, and GPS, when it comes to visual flight rules flying at night, I found it easier to navigate as the cities and towns are all glowing blobs of light. Even the highways are all lit up pathways from the headlights of the traffic below. But when I thought about trying to fly a Lancaster to a city hours away with all the lights below blacked out and half the electronic navigation aids being jammed or false, and hundreds of thousands of Germans all trying to kill you with radar, searchlights, night fighters, or flak, and doing all this in the cold, hypoxic upper atmosphere, And only after a couple of 100 hours of flying, and only being a teenager or a 20-year-old, wow, the realization hits hard. Also, while flying at our flight school, I met my first actual Lancaster vet, Paul, who had also been a navigator and who became an engineer after the war. He was a character, ex-RAF with the British accent and gentlemanly yet slightly doddering demeanor. He didn't talk too much about his wartime experiences, although I do remember one time I overheard him talking about what it was like to be flying through a spot of flak and rubbish. It sounded very British. Okay, so we need to fast forward again slightly to get to my first view of an actual Lancaster in action. This was during my 300 nautical mile commercial cross-country flight. I'm not sure if all countries do this, but planning and flying a flight to an airport 300 nautical miles out from your origin is a requirement for the Canadian commercial pilot's license, and was the longest cross-country flight that I had done at the time. The training program that I was following obliged me to fly from Montreal to London, Ontario, in a Cessna 172, which would fulfill the requirement. However, I had planned to make a stop at Hamilton, Ontario to visit the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum and to see their Lanc named Vera. Of course, the timing didn't work out, and my flying companion Dennis and I were disappointed that we couldn't visit the museum. However, while I was doing my walk-around on the Cessna, we heard from across the field the thrum, thrum, thrum of engines that we couldn't recognize. Could those be Merlins? Yes! The Lanc taxied out, ran up her engines, and then took off right in front of us. Dennis took picture after picture. This was pre-digital, and we didn't know if any of them would turn out, but they did. I will share some on the Patreon page, and one of them became my first logo for World of Warbirds. Many years later, camping near Niagara Falls, Ontario, I again heard that distinctive thrum 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 of the 4 Merlins, and overhead flew Vera several times. Niagara Falls and the only Canadian flying Lancaster in the world in one day? Does it get any better? Growing older, though, I no longer see the Lancaster and what it did through rose-colored glasses, like some sort of historic real-world machine hero, like the Millennium Falcon on Star Wars. There's no controversy with the Falcon. However, during my lifetime, there has been plenty of debates over the effectiveness and the ethics of strategic bombing in general, and the area bombing that our Commonwealth Lancasters were doing in particular. A Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, documentary production called Death by Moonlight enraged many former aircrew because of its portrayal of the ineffectiveness and the questionable ethics of their mission. The award-winning documentary caused such a brouhaha that veteran groups sued the filmmakers, and the Senate of Canada actually held hearings about it. Back then, the Queen Mum tried to have its broadcast in the UK blocked. And even though many different types of aircraft such as Halifaxes and Stirlings were involved in the bombing campaign, like it or not, they have all come to be represented by the Lancaster. The Canadian War Museum also ran into a similar controversy with its exhibit on strategic bombing. Veteran groups again appealed to the Senate, who, although they agreed that the exhibit was historically accurate, asked that the wording be changed to discuss the nuances more. I honestly think all sides are looking to tell the truth, but which flavor of the truth? Over the years, I've lived through several periods of controversy about strategic bombing. Down south, there was a kerfuffle over the display of the Enola Gay. In the UK, there was a debate over whether statues and memorials to Bomber Harris and Bomber Command should be taken down. As an amateur historian, I worry about erasing memory. These things happened. Covering them up now doesn't make them unhappen in the past, and could very much cause worse to happen in the future. People should remember the cruelty that all-out war always uncorks. Although he was talking about a completely different war, I find a quote by William Tecumseh Sherman, Union General, fits perfectly. Open quotes. "You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out. I know I had no hand in making this war, and I know I will make more sacrifices today than any of you to secure peace." Close quotes. So far, the Lancaster aircraft itself has mainly escaped being labeled as a machine of war crimes, nor has there been any call to ground them in the name of not glorifying what they did. I think seeing these surviving aircraft on the ground and in the air help us learn and remember. One way or another, the sacrifices of those who participated in these battles need to be remembered. My connection with the Lancaster just seems to keep continuing. When I'm not sweating over a World of Warbirds episode, I work as an administrator at a high school. From the very beginning, I started an aviation club for the kids. One of my teacher colleagues, Peter Harding, and I were talking about the club one day, and he told me that his dad, John Harding, had flown in Lancs during the war, again as a navigator. I said, "It's too bad he didn't write down his experiences." Peter said, "Oh, he did. He wrote a book called The Dancing Navigator," and Peter brought it for me to read the next day. As part of the aviation club, I take kids up for rides in my Cessna 172. For the students who are really enthusiastic, we plan a cross-country flight from Montreal to Ottawa-Rockcliffe Airport, which is a former RCAF base and the site of the National Aviation and Space Museum of Canada. It's a thrilling day for the kids when we land and taxi to a parking spot behind the museum and get let in just like big shot VIPs through the airside doors. I've done the tour at the museum so many times that I can give it myself, and it's always a high point of the experience when we stop in front of the magnificent Lancaster Mark X KB944, named Winnie. Maybe it's just my overactive imagination, but its size and prominent place in the center of the museum make it seem as if it's presiding over the entire collection. We always stop and talk about how this type of Lancaster was built in Canada and what terrible things it was built to do. I say terrible not in judgment, but with the meaning that this airplane was able to unleash awesome power on an enemy city, and by doing so, certainly shortened the war for everyone. We always take a picture in front of Winnie, and then linger a bit at the exhibit, where you could look inside the nose section of another Lanc, where my students are always in awe that kids not much older than themselves flew the aircraft and operated its systems in the middle of the night and under such harsh and cramped conditions. So along with this podcast and channel that I am pleased to share with you, this is what I see as my continuing role of spreading the fascination with and information about these aircraft. It also brings me kind of full circle, because remember that pamphlet that my parents had brought home? Well, it was from this museum and about that Lancaster. And my love affair with the Lanc isn't over. I no longer wish to parachute out of one. I understand that, at least in combat, it could be quite difficult to get out of a Lancaster. Besides, I don't think the museum organizations that fly them would be too keen. Anyway, I've got a few parachute jumps under my belt already, and I think I'm done with that activity. But it certainly is possible to buy a ride in Vera, and this I have yet to do. And if I ever get the chance, I will be sure to take you listeners along with me for the ride. I hope you didn't mind this highly personal account of a love affair with a warbird. The next one will be more my usual style. Thank you for listening, and please, if you've enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. Until next time.